Britain's major galleries house some of the finest collections of art to be found anywhere in the world.
But there are thousands of other artworks we know little about in the collections of smaller institutions. Over 80% of this publicly owned treasure is in storage and often uncatalogued. We don't know the name of the artist, the subject, or when and where they were painted.
The Art UK website was created to shine a light into these shadows and now has over 200,000 paintings online. Using this database, we'll be travelling the country, seeking out potential lost masterpieces.
When we find an interesting painting, I'll investigate the story behind its creation, using a meticulous process of restoration, research, and scientific analysis.
I'll be exploring the world in which these works were created, the social and historical background to the life of the artist, which gives a painting its context. But simply finding a painting is just the beginning of the trail.
"20 miles south of Manchester, nestled in the gently undulating farmland of Cheshire, Tatton Park is today in the joint care of the National Trust and Cheshire County Council. Tatton had been part of the extensive estates of the grand Egerton family since Elizabethan times. We'll be tracing the rise and fall of the Egertons of Tatton, who found keeping up with their wealthy relatives was often a challenge.
In its Victorian heyday, the weekend parties at this mansion were legendary. The guests were pampered with luxurious fixtures and fittings, and the house even had its own underground railway.
Country house owners like to impress their guests with the way that their houses worked almost invisibly.
But their final moment of triumph at the top of the social ladder was short-lived.
We're on the trail of a painting that's confounded the scholars for years. Our mission is to finally identify the artist who painted it, but it won't be easy.
The problem is, in this state, I just don't think we can get anywhere close to trying to figure out who it is.
On the hunt for our picture, my guide today is Carolyn Latham. We made our way to the entrance hall, where the picture I'd come to see has been hanging since 1897, when it was bought by Wilbraham, the first Earl Egerton of Tatton.
Now, Carolyn, normally when I come to a place like this, I have a pair of binoculars, but I've forgotten them today. Have you got a ladder?
Yeah, I think we can certainly get you a ladder and get you up a bit higher to him.
A few minutes later, I was mounting the steps to get eye to eye with the subject of our portrait.
When I first saw this picture on Art UK, it reminded me of a painter called Parmigianino. If that sounds like a cheese, it actually refers to an Italian artist called Girolamo Mazzola. He was a little fellow and he came from Parma, so they called him Parmigianino. Now, he was a boy wonder of the Italian Renaissance. He had a masterful technique, he could paint anything. But I'm only really at hand height here, so I can't tell a great deal. And I think it's time to try and get the picture off the wall for a closer look.
This picture, with what looks like a medical textbook open on the table, is referred to on Art UK as being a portrait of a physician. The house staff soon had the picture down from the wall and moved to a more convenient spot for our first consultation.
Now, it's at times like this when I make my first examination of a picture in good, clear daylight that I sometimes think, what have you done? But the die is cast and here we are. And the first thing that catches my eye, really, is the condition of it. It's clearly on a massive wooden panel and it's got quite a significant split down the side here. Some of the paint layer appears to be flaking off or has indeed flaked off, and there are some sizable holes, particularly in the costume and the drapery. And it's that paint loss and flaking which makes reading the attribution, the quality of this painting, quite a challenge at the moment. Look at his face, for example. On the left-hand side, well, it looks that the outline and the eye socket is all rather poor quality and meaningless. But then look at the eye on the right-hand side. That's in much better condition. And the wrist here, the way it falls over, it does look slightly disjointed, but it's also beautifully elegant and, indeed, mannered.
Art historians now use the term mannerism to describe a time in the middle of the 16th century when Italian artists developed an awkwardly unnatural or mannered style. It seems a very appropriate description of this picture, and I'm sure it was painted in Italy during the Mannerist period. But can I be confident it's by Parmigianino?
Absolutely not. I have to say, it's the longest of long shots. But if there's even a chance of finding a lost Parmigianino, then we have to grab this opportunity with both hands.
While Bendor gets to grips with our painting, I want to delve into the history of the Egerton family who lived in this house. The Tatton Park estate was bought by Sir Thomas Egerton, a local Cheshire lawyer, in 1598. A favourite of Elizabeth I, he became Lord Chancellor, accumulated vast wealth, and lived in great style. But not at Tatton Park. With no grand house on the estate, Tatton was not a desirable property and was eventually passed down to an ambitious junior branch of the family. These lesser Egertons had little money and no titles. And to rub salt into the wounds, they had some very grand and wealthy relatives. However, the next 2 centuries would see the family claw their way up the social ladder. The Egerton rise to fame and fortune began with a good marriage. This is plain old Mr. John Egerton, who married into a wealthy family called the Hills of Hawkstone. Many years later, when our painting was purchased, it was thought to be a portrait of the founder of the Hill dynasty, a 16th century Lord Mayor of London, Rowland Hill. And here he is, not looking too much like the man in our painting. Knowing who the sitter is can be extremely helpful in working out who painted a portrait, but I think we can rule out Rowland Hill. However, the Hill family connection was to prove important when tragedy struck the Egertons. In 1724, when John Egerton died unexpectedly, it was the Hill fortune that saved Tatton Park. Elizabeth Egerton, his widow, sought the help of her rich and well-connected brother Samuel Hill, who found a plum job for her eldest son, his namesake Samuel Egerton.
This is Samuel Egerton. He was sent out to Venice by his uncle, Samuel Hill, as just a young man of 18. He was apprenticed to Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith was the British consul in Venice, and he was right at the heart of the art trade. He was putting in touch all the artists with all these wealthy young gentlemen who were out there for the grand tour, buying up artifacts and paintings to bring them back to furnish their English estates. Samuel Egerton had a very good time in Venice, and he was more renowned for maybe having a good time than necessarily doing the work that he should have been.
Yeah, I imagine there were untold temptations.
I think so. As an 18-year-old,
yeah.
And he had this lovely portrait painted while he's out there, and he's pointing towards the customs house where he had been working.
While Samuel Egerton was working in Venice, his boss, Joseph Smith, pulled off the smartest move of his career. He signed an exclusive deal with the most popular painter in the city, Canaletto, whose views of Venice had created a buying frenzy amongst the visiting British collectors. As an insider in the firm, Samuel managed to secure a pair of Venetian views for his uncle, Samuel Hill. They are amongst the first Canalettos to arrive in Britain and are now hanging in Tatton Park.
There's lots of correspondence in our collection of the length of time it took Canaletto, with all these commissions coming in, for him to actually finish the paintings off and get them sent back to Samuel Hill back in England.
So if this painting was commissioned by Samuel Hill, how has it come to be here in Tatton Park?
Well, Samuel Hill left these 2 paintings to his nephew, Samuel Egerton, as well as a big, healthy slice of his vast fortune. And that Hill family money coming to the Egertons really enabled them to turn their fortunes around.
The
The Egertons, now in possession of a sizable fortune, rebuilt Tatton, employing one of the most fashionable architects of the day, Samuel Wyatt. But the occupants of this grand mansion were still just Mr. and Mrs. Egerton. The ambition of the next generations would be acquiring a title, and to do this they made the house a byword for luxury and threw the smartest house parties whose guest lists were peppered with royalty.
Our Tatton Park physician has arrived at the studio of picture restorer Simon Gillespie for a first assessment of the work ahead. I was pleased to see that the painting is on a poplar wood panel, exactly what we would expect from 16th century Italy. But once it was out of its frame and on an easel, I had to confess it did look a bit forlorn. I always get overexcited by a picture above a door.
Well, how high was that door?
I thought the drawing of the head looked very like Parmigianino.
From 50 metres it does, yeah.
The problem is, in this state, I just don't think we can get anywhere close to trying to figure out who it is.
Well, you wouldn't, yeah.
I think there's a better picture in here somewhere.
Well,
Can you help me?
I can help you. Let me see what I see. I can see that there is crackling of the paint. So cracking of the paint is sort of sending off reflections. You can't really see into the picture. There seems to be a damage on his eye, and just to the left of his eye. The panel itself has got an old join that's opened up and split, and there are various other splits, and it's all rather confusing, isn't it?
Is there anything good?
Well, let's have a look. We've actually got a rather nice eye here.
I like the eye. People always say you need a good eye in this business.
Well, I always thought you had one.
One.
Here, you've got a couple of fingers that look quite nice.
A couple of fingers, are good fingers, two good fingers.
Look here, in the dark. If you look closely here, you see he's actually got a rather nice buckle.
Okay. One
With-
good eye, two good fingers.
Something to hold his trousers up with. A useless rug. What is going on here? He's reading. What is his bedtime reading?
Well, I think this is the key to figuring out who he is. It looks like some bit of human anatomy, isn't it, in that book? I'm sure he's a doctor.
There is also lots of overpaint on this picture.
Should we try a bit of ultraviolet?
Ultraviolet would probably pick it up, wouldn't it? Shall we go into the dark?
Okay. Yeah.
First thing.
It looks better in the dark, this painting.
So now you can see with the ultraviolet, you can see the darker spots are where the later retouching is.
There's a lot of dark spots.
Yeah, but there's also this yellow-green haze all over it. That is old organic varnish. You can see there's a long line where the retouching is along the joint of the two panels. You can also see that sort of speckling all over his face. Those are little spots of retouching. And you can see the retouching on the knot.
Yes. None of this is so far very encouraging.
No.
We should look at this like management advisors do, you know. We should think solutionistically and optimistically.
Yeah.
There are no problems, there are only opportunities here, Simon. Okay?
That's a great opportunity here. Yes, this can only get better.
So, shall I leave you to work out the best plan of attack for this picture?
I think this needs this needs a very good plan.
Okay.
Because we can't even wet it out because the painting is flaking.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to secure the paint, make a plan, all the menu of what
Okay.
can happen to it.
All right, I'll leave you on the sunbed.
Thank you very much.
This picture is certainly in a poor state, but I'm going to remain optimistic, as there is at least some evidence of a good artist at work here. But can we find out who? It would certainly help us to know who the sitter is. What's the book on the table? What does the diagram show? And is it good enough to be by Parmigianino? Girolamo Mazzola, better known as Parmigianino, was born in the northern Italian city of Parma in 1503. He came from a painting dynasty, but it was clear he had a unique talent, and he became master of the family workshop while still a teenager. In 1524, barely 20 years old, he painted this remarkable picture, an unnerving self-portrait in a convex mirror. He took it to Rome with him, where he was celebrated as a Raphael reborn. It's a brilliant example of the style we now call mannerism. The roots of mannerism lie in the work of the artists of the High Renaissance, particularly Michelangelo. Young painters who followed in their wake, like Parmigianino, were told that art had reached a kind of pinnacle, a point of serene accomplishment beyond which it was impossible to go. So how did they respond? Very strangely indeed. To see what I mean, let's have a look at a bona fide Parmigianino painting at the National Gallery, The Mystic Marriage of St. Catherine.
Earlier Renaissance artists, people like Raphael and Bellini, had tried to paint with such realism that as a viewer you would almost be tricked into believing that you were looking at the saints themselves, and perhaps even in the presence of God. But artists like Parmigianino, well, what could they do next? And they felt that they needed to smash those rules to break free from that sense of perfectionism. And so you get compositions like this, highly eccentric. And then within them, they decide to play around with the human form. And that's why the Madonna here is portrayed with these very elongated, almost unnatural limbs, what the art historian Giorgio Vasari called the figura serpentinata. Everything is rather serpentine.
This disregard for the rules is also evident in the fact that, shockingly, the Madonna has her back to us. And then all those important lessons about creating depth and perspective are jettisoned. The action is set hard up against a wall in a cramped space, with some unexplained and distracting goings-on in another room. The male figure in the bottom left could be Joseph, but he looks like a bizarre afterthought.
The technique in this painting is absolutely extraordinary. It's so spontaneous and sketchy. But above all, Parmigianino's main trick was a heightened sense of sensuality. There was no reason at all for the Madonna to look like a dowdy, purely maternal figure. Why couldn't she look like she just stepped off a catwalk? And why couldn't the figure of St. Catherine, with her hair done up like this and beautifully presented, look like a courtesan? And even, if you look closely, be dressed like one too.
So what can we see here that makes me think our portrait might have come from the same era? The sketchy technique is similar, but also the way our sitter is presented hard up against the background, and the complete disregard for perspective in the way the book is painted. But the picture is still so dirty and overpainted, it's difficult to judge its real quality. We need to let Simon do a bit more work on the restoration.
Back at Tatton Park, the dawn of the 19th century found the Egerton family established as wealthy landowners with a large estate and a big house. But the title that would cement their status still eluded them. A century after Samuel Hill's fortune saved the estate, William Egerton achieved the first notch on the peerage, becoming a baron. But it was his son, Wilbraham, the man who bought our painting, who was to really put Tatton Park and the Egerton name on the map. But he went about it in a slightly unusual way. I'm heading out into the park to look for a culinary relic from a bygone era of entertaining. Under Wilbraham, Tatton Park became something of a destination, developing a reputation for lavish and luxurious house parties. Wilbraham wanted to make an invite to stay at the house a thing of immense cachet. But we can trace the start of this trend back to Samuel Egerton and a craze for ice cream. 18th century English lords couldn't get enough of ice cream. It was a culinary sensation. First invented in the UK for King Charles II in 1671, it was such an expensive commodity that even the king's table only had one bowl to share amongst themselves. Everybody else had to look on and watch them enjoy it. This exotic treat became a staple of every aristocrat's dining table. But it was difficult to make in an age before freezers or even ice machines. In order to impress his guests, like country house owners with culinary aspirations across the country, the Egertons had to build one of these, an ice house. So to modernise, it looks fairly basic and a little bit spooky, but believe it or not, ice could be kept in here for up to a year without melting. So during the winter, the estate ponds would be harvested for ice, which was then stored in here and taken out as and when needed. It really seems that from Samuel onwards, keeping up with the latest technology was a family trait. The innovations really took off in the late 19th century, when Tatton Park became something of a test bed for domestic labour-saving technology. When Wilbraham inherited Tatton Park in 1883, the house employed the usual small army of domestic servants to cater to the comfort of the Egertons. However, working here was a little bit different. For a start, there was a railway in the basement. To put me on the right track, I met country house technology expert Ian West. So Ian, how did all of this work?
Well, this was a railway to move coal around the house. They needed such large quantities of coal to feed the boilers and also all the individual fireplaces. Men would move the coal around on these trucks. But this is a unique feature, really. The sophistication of this is much greater than we've seen in other country houses. It's sort of technology that was used in coal mines and factories, but not in houses.
And so what was the rationale behind that then? Was it like a labour-saving device for the staff, or...?
Partly, but also I think it's about making the house work efficiently, which is something that country house owners like to impress their guests with, the way that their houses worked almost invisibly.
In an age of rapid engineering progress, Wilbraham adapted cutting-edge technology to make a stay at Tatton memorable for his guests. The demands of running a house of this size required solutions on an industrial scale.
Here we have a turntable. They could spin the trucks around.
So it changes direction.
Correct.
That's so cool.
Yes, they could send coal in that direction to the boilers at that end of the house, and then back where we came from to the lift in that end of the house. But perhaps what is most intriguing is they put all this in, and within less than 10 years, it was largely obsolete.
The fact that the railway was so quickly superseded is a testament to Wilbraham's pursuit of technological solutions to the comfort of his guests. In the last decade of the 19th century, he was to turn Tatton Park into a marvel of the age, and in doing so, achieve the aristocratic title that had eluded the Egertons for so long.
I'm heading back to Simon's studio to see the progress on the restoration of our painting. I'm hoping that as the cleaning gets underway, we might uncover some evidence that would support my optimistic attribution to Parmigianino.
Hello.
Hello, look at this. So I've done multiple tests all over the place.
Okay, I can see those little stripes down there.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And they reveal that it is viable to do. So sometimes, if you've got a polyurethane varnish or something on there, it's very difficult to do.
Okay.
This one comes off. And the good news is that it reveals really quite a nice palette of well-preserved colours.
Okay, so first things first, so what about his costume?
We've done a large test in the middle here and exposed that there are 2 layers of overpaint, which we've managed to successfully remove. And then you've got a bit of dark paint here, which suggests a shadow of a niche. And then, actually, if you look carefully on this side, you see carefully here, you see this, there's a light line there.
He's in a niche.
Yeah.
Good. Well, I don't think I've brought you a picture where, at this stage in the process, there are still so many questions to be answered. And I just can't get to grips with it. And the only way we can answer those questions is, I think, through your magic wand, and particularly in the head. So I think we need to make some cleaning progress. That's
Okay.
all right.
The magical combination of chemicals and cotton wool begins to uncover a painting that might still save my blushes, especially as our sitter's face emerges from the dirty varnish.
The most three-dimensional object on the face is the nose.
It's a good nose. Oh, that is good.
Yeah.
I know when to spot a good nose, and that's a good nose. It's by someone good, this picture, isn't it?
It's certainly improving enormously. Yeah.
Thank God for that. Well, I mean, because normally if I bring you a duff picture, we're not doing it on TV, and I quickly put it in the cupboard of shame at home, as my wife calls it. But
You must have a very large cupboard by now.
it's very small, actually.
So I am very encouraged with that. Not only the array of colours, but actually the half-tones, these shadowy colours, are in lovely condition.
Always surprises me, Simon, how much an old varnish can suppress the flesh tones, particularly in a face.
We can just remove the last bit of overpaint here. We should have really quite a nice indication of how this man paints.
Very, very pleased with that. You've worked your magic, thank you.
It's so interesting seeing it now. It's just confounding me.
Well, I'm confounded, but I'm reassured because it's by someone good.
With the original paint surface now revealed, it's much easier to make a judgment on our artist's technique. The next step is to compare the way our portrait is painted with a known portrait by Parmigianino.
In 1883, Tatton Park was inherited by Wilbraham Egerton, the man who bought our painting. After Eton and Oxford, he became an MP and then succeeded his father in the House of Lords. All this was ultimately reflected in the improvements he made to Tatton Park. In the late 1880s, the novel basement railway was replaced as an ambitious new central heating plant was installed, which not only warmed the house, but was piped out to a network of greenhouses in the grounds.
But ultimately, all of this effort is to impress.
Yes, producing exotic fruit grown in your own gardens was a very prestigious thing to do.
The next development was the arrival of electricity, and Tatton was once more a pioneer. When its first electric plant was installed, it was one of only 14 houses in the country to be powered in this way. There's plenty of evidence of this phase still in the house. These jelly mould light switches, an electric motor to power the spit, and even an early electrically heated hostess trolley. This love of up-to-the-minute culinary technology, which began with ice cream from the ice house in the grounds, came full circle with the installation of an electric refrigerator.
A walk-in fridge.
A walk-in fridge. It's basically a large insulated cupboard. This was built in 1911, so it's almost certainly the oldest fridge in the country.
So we're in the oldest fridge in Britain,
Yes.
possibly.
So that's the view from below stairs. But did all this investment pay off for Wilbraham? In the 1890s, Tatton's house parties proved that a good invite is what it takes to rise up the social ladder. They even gained the royal seal of approval from that notorious party lover, the Prince of Wales. In 1897, after several centuries of diligent social climbing, Wilbraham was created the first Earl Egerton of Tatton.
So what did Wilbraham do when he achieved his ambition and became Earl Egerton? He threw his most extravagant party yet.
It was a themed fancy dress ball with over 250 guests. He and his wife were dressed as the Doge of Venice and the Queen of Cyprus. And to commemorate the occasion, they had their portraits painted in costume.
But sadly, this was to prove the high watermark for the fortunes of the Egertons and Tatton Park.
Despite a long life and 2 marriages, Wilbraham left no heir to inherit his hard-won title. He was the first, but also the last Earl Egerton. Tatton passed to a cousin, and the premier party palace of Cheshire began a long, slow decline, until in 1958, the last of the Egertons bequeathed the house to the National Trust.
To help me finally decide if Parmigianino could really have painted our portrait, I want to go and have a look at the painting that first made me think of him when I saw the Tatton picture on Art UK. It's in the collection of York Art Gallery. Portrait of a Man with a Book. What a powerful picture. This is the first time I've seen it in the flesh, so to speak. It seems to me to have so many features in common with our picture.
Some of the similarities are rather obvious. The carpet here, rather curiously plonked in the corner. And the book, beautifully painted, but one side of it is clearly much larger than the other. In real life, it wouldn't shut properly. Some of the details, too, I think are similar to our picture, like the fingertips. They go up at the end like little ski jumps. Above all, the way the eyes are painted, I thought was quite similar. That very sharp drawing of the lower lid with a lot of light catching it. And that leads you into the characterization of the sitter, who, like our sitter, is rather fearsome looking. They're two men whose pint you would not want to spill in the pub. But I have to say, having seen this picture in the flesh and having seen our picture partly restored, I'm afraid it's not good news for our painting. Just seeing it in the flesh, you could see that the flesh tones, for example, are painted by someone who's painting in this style for the very first time, who's working it all out. It's new, it's pioneering stuff. Whereas our painting feels slightly like it's coming in this artist's wake. He's following a style, he's not inventing one. I'm now absolutely certain that the Tatton Park picture was not painted by Parmigianino. Who was it painted by? Well, frankly, right now, God knows. It's back to square one.
Having lost my prime suspect, I have to accept that our picture must be by a follower of Parmigianino. But he was an exceptional talent, and he inspired a lot of followers. It'll be a challenge to pick up the scent again, and to kickstart the process, I'm going to meet an expert on this period of painting, David Egerton, who told me the reason Parmigianino was so influential was that he worked all over Italy.
He starts in Parma, and then he goes to Rome. He's in Rome for 3 years, 3 years in Bologna, and in all of these places, he's profoundly influential.
Yes.
He really casts a long shadow.
If you were looking, slightly further down the league table for names of people who were painting like Parmigianino but weren't quite him, where would you start?
Well, Bedley in Parma is absolutely the one on home territory.
Okay.
But then in Bologna, he has an effect on lots and lots of people, but most notably, the one who's closest to him is an artist called Girolamo da Carpi.
Right.
And then in Rome, Francesco Salviati, who's a Florentine who goes to Rome.
Right.
And Vasari, the author of The Lives of the Artists, who's slightly underrated as an actual painter.
Yes, this is a period in Italian art when names are quite fluid, attributions are quite fluid. I mean, sometimes I think, why did somebody not just tell these artists to sign the damn painting?
I am absolutely of the opposite opinion. If they all signed, we'd be out of a job. You'd never be able to make an attribution.
I suppose we would be out of a job.
A disaster.
David's list of 4 likely lads has given me lots to think about. And to help focus my deliberations, I return to Simon's to have another look at the picture.
Well, the picture now has been fully cleaned. All the dirt's been taken off. All of the old varnish has been taken off. The original paint has been exposed with a wonderful patina on it, cracks, but unfortunately quite a lot of damage as well.
At this point, the painting is looking at its absolute worst, but the prognosis for our physician is good.
But the good thing about paint on panel is that it retains this rather nice, rich, flat surface, which gives a much richer colour. If this had been on canvas, no doubt the glues in the canvas would have actually discoloured the paint much more so. You wouldn't get this richness that it's got now. But the artist it's almost as if he's a wall painter or one of those.
He's quite fresco, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This final thought from Simon struck me like a bolt from the blue. The sketchiness of our portrait does have similarities to the way fresco is painted, working quickly against the clock on wet plaster. I think we're looking for an artist influenced by Parmigianino, who was also an accomplished fresco painter. We're narrowing the field.
Meanwhile, one line of inquiry we've been waiting for is the records relating to our portrait held by the National Trust's Central Archives. Not surprisingly, they include a lot of speculation about who might have painted the picture. Many knowledgeable art historians have looked at our portrait over the years and indulged in a bit of learned guesswork. There are half a dozen suggestions of lesser-known Italian painters, all from the middle of the 16th century. There's another interesting lead here, though. The physician was bought at an auction by the dealer Colnaghi, who sold it to Wilbraham Egerton. I've got the auction record here. The picture was attributed to a painter named Cecchino da Salviati.
Bingo! Cecchino is an affectionate shortening of Francesco. It's beginning to look like Salviati is our man. The next step is to go and look at some of his work and see if we can make a match to our painting. Francesco Salviati, born in Florence in 1510, was 7 years younger than Parmigianino, and like his hero, he worked all over Italy. Here's a self-portrait. I'm immediately struck by the way he set himself against a flat architectural niche, similar to the background Simon has uncovered in our painting. He does look a bit moody, and he's said to have frequently fallen out with his patrons. On one occasion, things got so stormy, his client had him arrested. I've come to Rome to check out one commission, which does seem to have gone smoothly.
During his second spell in Rome in the 1540s, Salviati was commissioned to paint a chapel in this church, Santa Maria dell'Anima. It's the church of the German community in Rome, and I'm really hoping it's going to help us with our attribution.
Here, Salviati is working in fresco, a technique in which he clearly excelled. But it was a challenge. The chapel is an awkward one, very tall and narrow. Over the main altar is a Pieta, the dead Christ in his mother's arms, and above is Christ resurrected, while in the wings are lesser characters from the biblical narrative. It's a masterful piece of composition.
Goodness, poor old Salviati. It seems so unfair that this absolute masterpiece has been ignored. God is extraordinarily good. I mean, obviously the whole thing is unapologetically mannerist. There's barely a straight line in it.
The dead Christ's serpentine pose is classic mannerism, awkward and unnatural.
Which is a great contrast with the figure of Christ resurrected above. He's very much alive, isn't he? And even flamboyantly so. He's running back into the scene. Hello, I'm here.
The first thing to say, to save my blushes, is how very much this shows the influence of Parmigianino.
I'm particularly drawn to the head of Joseph of Arimathea in the background of the main picture. Well, that could almost be a direct quotation from Parmigianino's own portrait of Moses, the rather fearsome, bearded-looking man glancing down. And the way his eyes are painted, well, that's extremely Parmigianino-esque. With a very heavy sculptural eyelids, the light catching the bottom lid, and then lashings of mascara on top. And then, illusionistically, it's a real triumph, this painting, because the main section of frame around the figure of Christ resurrected, well, it looks like a frame that's coming out from the surface of the wall, but actually it isn't. It's all flat. It's all painted in one go. It's so impressively done. Even with the binoculars, my brain is still being fooled into thinking that these stone ledges are actually made of stone. Fantastic.
I'm very glad I've seen this, because it's clear that Salviati was a terrific painter. I think our big takeaway from this chapel is the fluid brushwork. You can really see how his urgent, sketchy fresco technique is reflected in the way the Tatton Park portrait is painted. However impressive this chapel is, it's only a minor commission in an obscure church in the back streets of Rome, and might give the impression that Salviati was a minor painter. In order to establish his real worth, my next stop is his home city of Florence, where Salviati was held in such high regard he was asked to decorate the most important room in the seat of government.
The fellow on the horse here is the first Grand Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo I de' Medici. He became the city's ruler in 1537. He was the most enthusiastic patron of the arts that Florence had known for a generation.
But Cosimo was an authoritarian despot, and hard as nails. He moved his family to live in the seat of the city's government, the forbidding stone fortress of the Palazzo della Signoria. Not surprisingly, he decided to make a few home improvements, though. The man he put in charge of the project was the great historian of the Renaissance, painter and writer Giorgio Vasari, who spent the last 20 years of his life as Cosimo's interior decorator.
Now, Vasari was very industrious, but to be honest, he was no great shakes as a painter. So faced with such a colossal task, he very wisely decided to parcel out the work to the best artists he could find. And one of them was Francesco Salviati.
Salviati was commissioned to fresco the audience chamber, where Cosimo would have heard petitions, and he painted a thinly veiled caricature of him personified as a despotic Roman general. Cosimo loved it.
Now, the paintings are called the Triumph of Marcus Furius Camillus, and to be honest, I think they should also be called the Triumph of Francesco Salviati, because they're absolutely spectacular. One of those cases where if they'd been in a museum and easy for people to see, I think Salviati would be much better known. If we look at some of the details, we can see just how good Salviati was. They're fantastic. On the left here is Marcus Furius Camillus himself, having defeated his Etruscan enemies, there weighed down with angst and defeat underneath his chariot. And then below that, there is the most fantastic goat's head, who is glancing in a rather languid manner towards where Cosimo himself would have sat, as if to say, not sure about him. Now, this is speculation, but Salviati was a proper Republican citizen of Florence, so perhaps he might not have approved of the way Cosimo I de' Medici was assuming dictatorial powers. But often in works like this, you see artists inserting themselves in little self-portrait, and they're usually looking directly at you. In this cycle, the only figure who is looking directly out of the walls towards the viewer is this little person up here on the left, and he does look extremely like Salviati.
The small clues that were visible through the dirt and damage when I first saw our Tatton Park physician convinced me that it was by a really good artist, and I'm now confident that that person is Francesco Salviati. But back in London, I'm keen to see if we can go one better and work out who the sitter is. Is he really a physician? And are there any clues in the picture which might help reveal his identity?
We know that when the painting first hung on the wall at Tatton, it was described as showing Rowland Hill, the Egerton ancestor responsible for the family fortune. But we can be sure that that's just wishful thinking. First, Hill never looked like our sitter at all, and also, he never went to Italy.
We also know that when Wilbraham Egerton bought the portrait back in 1897, it was listed as an unknown sitter.
So was that a dead end? Well, happily not.
If we are going to be able to discover the identity of the sitter, it'll have to be from clues within the picture itself. And the most significant one must be the book, with its precisely drawn anatomical depiction.
What is this organ, and will it help identify the specialism of the man in our portrait?
I sent a close-up to our old friend, Oxford historian of science, Professor Alan Chapman. A few days later, while rummaging in yet another library, I received his learned opinion.
Regarding the section from the portrait, I would suggest
tentatively that the dissected organ depicted was a heart. It certainly strikes me as a soft organ and seems to have a bag below and structures coming from the top. Unfortunately, the sitter's arm seems to be obscuring the lower part of the structure, but my bet is that it represents a heart. Well, this is tremendously helpful. We can narrow down the search for our sitter now. We are looking for someone who was an anatomist working in Italy in the 1550s, in about his mid to late 30s, who was a specialist in the heart, as someone who was possessed of fine eyes, a handsome beard, and that universal sign of distinction and intelligence, a receding hairline. There are a couple of likely suspects for our sitter. The first is Andreas Vesalius. He was the father of Renaissance anatomy. And he looks quite similar, but he's always shown, as here, with a full head of hair. More likely, I think, is this fellow called Realdo Colombo, who also fits our time frame and made a study of the heart. The eyes match, the nose matches. I think that's a really close match. I think Colombo is our man.
Realdo Colombo was working in Italy at a time when the science of anatomy was making rapid progress. And an essential element in this process was the need for accurate depictions of the human body. This beautifully hand-coloured volume is a rare edition of his colleague and rival Andrea Vesalius' treatise on anatomy belonging to Cambridge University Library. It even has the original pop-up layers for students to see how the organs of the body and the nervous system are overlaid. The dissected figures are posed in attitudes reminiscent of classical sculptures, betraying Vesalius' Renaissance mindset. Over a video link, I asked Dr. Philippa Hellawell if science and art were advancing simultaneously.
Absolutely, there is almost a symbiotic relationship between the intentions of artists and anatomists in this period. And in many ways, you know, their work helps reinforce the other. So for instance, with anatomical learning, images are central to communicating medical ideas about the body and also exploring the different layers of the human body, which we see in Vesalius's text here. And on the other side, we have artists who are working towards a more naturalistic representation of the human body. And so things like understanding movement and the muscular composition of the body is incredibly important. And so we do have artists such as Da Vinci and Michelangelo attending dissections and also conducting dissections themselves in order for them to refine their understanding of how the body is composed and how it works.
We think that our portrait might be of another anatomist from this period, a man named Realdo Colombo. Do you think that's possible?
It very much could be Colombo. He was working in Padua around this time, and he is famed for quite a few interesting discoveries. He had quite an interesting rivalry with another anatomist called Falloppio of fallopian tube fame. And this was over the discovery of the clitoris, which is quite an interesting episode in the history of medicine, that we have two 16th century male anatomists arguing over the discovery of the clitoris, which of course women had known about for many centuries.
Are you serious? That's hilarious.
Colombo is known for first identifying, at least in his mind, the clitoris as a sexual organ, and this being the seat of woman's pleasure. He even describes it as the sweetness of Venus, referring to the Roman goddess of love.
Did he publish his discoveries?
Colombo published his own anatomical work, which ran into 15 volumes. There were no illustrations in Colombo's work, though it had been his intention to enlist his friend Michelangelo to provide the illustrations, because Colombo had served as Michelangelo's physician. Unfortunately, this never came to fruition, but it would be an incredibly popular work if it had. So if your portrait is of Colombo, then I do think this is a very significant find.
With strong candidates for both the artist and the sitter, I really feel our painting has turned out to be a fascinating discovery. It's time to return to Simon's studio and see the results of his weeks of work with the swabs.
Ah, I see. Looking good as new. Fantastic.
It's a great transformation.
Well, yet another victory snatched from the jaws of defeat.
It is, isn't it? Good, I'm glad you think so.
As usual, I am in awe at the transformation Simon has achieved. The cleaned and restored picture is far better than I could have hoped, with a new depth and vibrancy, bringing the sitter to life. The most obvious change is the removal of the background murk to reveal architectural columns framing the sitter. The paint loss and damage to the eyes caused by the shrinking wooden panel has been beautifully repaired, and even his belt buckle has been given a shine.
I do love this recess. It's a lovely trick that an artist gives a little bit more depth into the painting. I think the face and the mask of the sitter is great. Good piece of painting. The man who painted it knew what he was doing.
Yeah. It's been quite the magical mystery tour around mid-16th century Italian painting. We started at the top, if you remember, with Parmigianino, which you quickly disabused me of. And I think you were right. We're hoping it's by Francesco Salviati.
That's a big name, though, still.
It is. I think it's a big name, and it would be one of very few works by him in the country. So let's see what the expert says.
I'm happy to say that expert, in the form of Italian painting scholar David Egerton, has just arrived to give his verdict.
So, David, here's our physician.
Well, I'd better get in and have a good look at the guy.
Having taken my time to examine so many pictures myself, I really should be more patient at this point in the process.
Well, it's a serious painting. It's really very, very good.
That's a promising start.
And even little details, like this incredible detail on his belt, are beautifully done, full of life, and almost, because it's in a monochrome, it's almost like a drawing.
After giving David a reasonable time to get to grips with the picture, I posed the all-important question.
So, David, if we were going to advise Tatton Park what to put on the label and they rehang this painting, what should we say?
Very good question. If I had to put a name on it, then I think the name would be Francesco Salviati.
Oh,
Amazing.
That's great.
It's perfectly clear that Salviati was a very admired and accomplished portraitist, and there are a number of pretty secure portraits by him, and this portrait fits, I think, very decently with what we know of his work.
That's great. Well, thank you very much. That's the best possible outcome.
Very exciting.
Back at Tatton, the physician is ready to be rehung in the space it has occupied ever since it was purchased in 1897 by Wilbraham Egerton. The guides will have a new story to tell about who painted the picture and who it portrays. A small group of socially distanced house staff assembled in the entrance hall to hear Bendor's news.
When I first stood up the rather wobbly ladder up there, I'm afraid to say the blood went very much to my head, and I thought this painting was possibly by an Italian Renaissance artist called Parmigianino, who's one of the greatest names of art history. I'm afraid I was completely wrong. It's not by him at all. It's by someone who was very much inspired by him, and he was called Francesco Salviati. And we've shown the painting to Professor David Egerton, who is the top banana on all these things, and he's in very little doubt that this is by Salviati. One of the reasons Salviati is not very well known in this country is because there's no work securely attributed to him in a UK public collection. So Tatton is now the only place in the country where you can come and see a portrait by Salviati. We have been able to identify the sitter as well. He was one of the top anatomists of the Italian Renaissance, and his name was Realdo Colombo. And one of the major breakthroughs he made was in discovering how the heart works. So that is why you see here a drawing of what we are very certain is a human heart. And it turns out, in a case of perhaps of great minds think alike, independently to us, the identification of the sitter has also been established by an academic in America called Monique Cornell. So we are very certain that this is of Realdo Colombo.
To actually know who he now is, you know, and who painted him, that's just great, instead of it being, you know, unknown, or this weird story of Rowland Hill that didn't make sense. I think our visitors are really going to enjoy that. I think this is really great that we've actually got a story to tell them.